afternoon. I want to welcome you all to the second annual Elm City Lit Fest and our panel discussion this afternoon with women writers of color, very specifically Black women writers. And the panel of today focuses on writing of the African diaspora. And we have two wonderful writers with us today, Deesha Philyaw and Nicole Blades. I am Lisa Denise Gray. I'll be your host and moderator for this evening, or this afternoon. I want to start by introducing our writers for this afternoon to you. They will then each read a segment of the books that we're focusing on today, and then we're going to dive into a conversation about their work and the craft of writing. So let's start with Deesha. Deesha Philyaw's debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which I must tell you is a wonderful read, won the 2021 Faulkner Award for Fiction, the 2020-2021 Story Prize, and the 2020 LA Times Book Prize, the Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, and was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction, which I must tell you is a really big deal. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies focuses on Black women, sex, and the Black church, and is being adapted for television by HBO Max with Tessa Thompson executive producing. Deesha is also a Kimbilio Fiction Fellow and will be the 2022-2023 John and Renée Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. Deesha's debut short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. Oh, we did that one already. There we go. Sorry about that. Next, we have Nicole Blades, who is a novelist, speaker, and journalist who has been putting her stories on paper since the third grade. She was born and raised in Montreal, Quebec, by Caribbean parents. Nicole moved to New York City and launched her journalism career working at Essence Magazine. She later co-founded the online magazine, She Networks, and worked as an editor at ESPN and Women's Health. As a freelance journalist, Nicole's articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Runner's World, Women's Health, Good Housekeeping, Health, MarieClaire.com, TheWashingtonPost.com, and more. Her latest book, Have You Met Nora, along with her previous novels, The Thunder Beneath Us and Earth's Waters, are available wherever books are sold. Nicole is a proud member of the Tall Poppy Writers, a professional group of women writers committed to supporting and promoting its members' work and connecting authors with readers. And she is also a National Academy of Sports Medicine certified personal trainer. Oh, go ahead, girl. She has been a presenter and guest speaker at conferences such as the Massachusetts Conference for Women, the Muse and the Marketplace, Mom 2.0 Summit, Well-Bred Black Girl Festival, love them, Writers Digest Conference, and the Women's Fiction Writers Association Retreat, and the Surrey International Writers Conference. She lives in New England with her husband and their son, and you may find her on social media on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So, before we dive, so I'm really excited to talk to you both. Before we dive in, I want to remind folks that we are in a bookstore, which means that I'm going to ask you to buy some books because they sell books, so buy some books. So let's dive into our reading. Who would like to start?
Oh. I thought you were going to say me. No. Very sneaky. All right, I'm going to read, but some disclaimers first. So I have not had the pleasure of being in front of an audience, a live audience, in 18 months. So I'm excited and also a little bit of like, what do I do? And there's a little bit of an accent in here. My parents are from Barbados, so I think I do a good Bajan accent, but if there's anyone from Barbados out there who disagrees, keep it to yourself. Don't hurt my feelings. Okay, so this is, I'll tell you a little bit about the book first.
Okay.
So Have You Met Nora is the story of a young woman who is living an incredible life. She is a mixed race woman, but she has been passing as white and privileged and affluent for more than half her life. So she has been going along living this very charmed life, and she's about to marry into a New York family, a New York royal family, so to speak. And her life is going to be that much more charmed. However, there's someone from her past who knows who she really is, who pops up in her present, and who is threatening to burn it all down to the ground for reasons. And it becomes a question of how far a person is willing to go to protect their ideal self. And so that's what this book is about. It's about race, it's about identity, it's about privilege and colorism. And so the chapter I'm going to read from is earlier in the book. It's chapter 3, and it's kind of a flashback. It's the only flashback in the book. It's in Montreal, and Nora is 9 in this segment. The rest of the book, she's a fully grown-up adult woman. All right, so, and I'm also not used to reading. I'm used to Zooms at this point, so I'm not used to reading with a mask and everything, so bear with me. All right, chapter 3, Montreal, Nora, age 9. Fix your face. Nora could set her watch to those 3 words. It's probably Zoom, like saying, how dare you speak of ill of me. All right. Montreal, Nora, age 9. Fix your face. Nora could set her watch to those 3 words. Her mother said them nearly every time she looked over at her. It wasn't because Nora had some proclivity for sulking or an unpleasant resting scowl and needed regular reminders to adjust her hanging grimace. The mother's directive was steeped in something else, something more disheartening than basic berating. This mother believed that Nora, her only child, was destined for good fortune and greatness. But it all hinged on how beautiful she appeared to others, how gracious and pleasant, welcoming and willing. This mother, she wanted her daughter to always be seen as pretty, pure, and simply better. Nora was to be preferred and obvious choice, far greater than all that surrounded her. Light, right, right. 3 more words that were baked into Nora's entire being. From her exceptionally green eyes and naturally blonde streaked hair to her tiny face, all fine and symmetrical, and the color of the milkiest tea. Nora was an unmistakable beauty, an extraordinary one, as her mother tells it. But to Nora, none of it mattered. The fawning and fixation from her mother and strangers alike, it was all just words, wishes, and when it came down to it, a weight around Nora's neck. What did I tell you about staring out at the sun, into the sun like that? Nora's mother said, frowning. Now come over here and help me with this. It's coming up on tea and I ain't even cut up the cucumber yet. She shook her head, annoyed, and returned to folding a basket of white clothes, separating out those shirts that would be ironed in the afternoon during her late lunch. And fix your face. Nora did as told, resetting her expression, removing the scrunch from her brows, letting her jaw settle, and dimming her eyes, but not before rolling them in full view of her mother. She glanced down at Nora. You act like life is so hard, but it's not for you. She shook her head once more. You don't know the first thing about hard life. People like you, a girl child like you could never know. She jabbed a crumbled men's undershirt in Nora's face, her lips pursed, waiting for her daughter's good sense to take hold. You know, when I was a little girl back in BIM, Nora's mother said, a tender smile creeping across her face, I was all too happy when my Auntie Pearl asked me to help her do anything. Folding clothes, washing the wares, cleaning up fish heads, combing her hair, anything. I was there when she called on me, just to spend time with her. And on a bright summer morning like this, you could tell me the sky was turning green and I wouldn't care. I wasn't going nowhere. I was with my Auntie Pearl. Dumb, Nora mumbled. Doing chores, particularly this chore of folding someone else's clothes, was boring and useless enough, she thought, without having to listen to her stories from back home in BIM, with her little lessons tucked into the hem. And hearing her mother talk about green skies only made her crave escape even more. Nora stepped up to the tip of her bare toes, hoping to see past the broad clothes basket and look through the laundry room's bay window. All she could make out was a clear strip of blue sky and a swatch of green, some ivy dangling from the rare stone walls. Rara, if you're gonna help me fold, then fold. Her mother gestured to the undershirt, his shirt, still a jumble in Nora's small hands. I don't like this. You know I don't. Nora tossed the shirt back into the basket and folded her arms instead. And I wish you would stop calling me that too. All these names, Rara, Tanty, Dr. B, Mistress B, sounds old and corny and ignorant. She pushed her chin out, closed her eyes, and waited for it, her mother's loud kiss of her teeth, a rough nudge in the small of her back, or worse, the pinch, and a few sharp words, letting her know that she was dismissed from laundry duty, free to go and nestle in the prickly lawn out back and gaze up at the cloudless sky. After a long pause, Nora opened her right eye, then her left, and was startled by what she saw. Her mother was still standing next to her, neatly folding each white item. No heated glares, no slaps to her ear, no muttered threats, just folding. Nora watched for a moment as her mother, with her crisply pressed uniform, continued to move slowly and evenly, plucking the things from the basket. One crumpled pillowcase, to the iron pile it went. Two slinky women's trouser socks, matched, then rolled together as a pair and placed on top of a short stack of the doctor's cotton t-shirts. Nora stayed locked on that neat pile. Even though the shirts were freshly laundered, his scent, a distinct mix of salt, whiskey, and dead leaves, lingered, making its way up Nora's nostrils. She felt the tops of her ears heating up as she clenched her jaw, fixing her stare on her mother's dark brown, chapped, dry hands, so dedicated to this ridiculous task. As the silence began to fill each corner of the narrow, white-tiled space, Nora could feel the heat from her ears spreading across her face. The long, bluish vein at her left temple started to quiver, or so it felt. Nora ran her 2 fingers the length of it, thinking of the countless times her mother had cursed the thing, this reminder of her white father Nora never met. And then she said it. "Your life isn't worth much, you know." Finally, her mother stopped moving, resting her hands gently on the edge of the wicker basket. Though the words were intended to hurt her mother, something, a stinging residue, lingered on Nora's lips. The mother tilted her head toward her daughter and spoke slowly. "Now, you can hold your breath and stomp your feet all morning, Miss Nora, but you're 9, a child. You don't know the first thing about what anything is worth." She went back to folding. "Besides, my life, our life, is the best it can be, Rara. All thanks to Dr. and Mistress Bourdain. Them people are good to us, treat us decent. One day you'll see that. You'll see beyond all your selfish, spiteful ways, and you'll be grateful for this. But it might be too late." Nora released her arms from the tight twist across her chest, but kept her fists clenched. "I hate this life," she said, and punched the side of her own leg. "You're almost done here, Nora," her mother said, pointing at the near-empty clothes basket. Rolled up at the bottom of it were an old tube sock, a hand towel, and Dr. Bourdain's golf shirt. Nora peered at the shirt and back at the side of her mother's plump brown face. Then, without a qualm tingling in any part of her, she spat into the basket. A line of dribble clung to the bottom of her lip. "Child!" her mother snapped. Before her mother could look her in the eye, Nora ran on, down the 3 narrow steps, through the kitchen, and out the back door. Nora's bare feet slapped the cool grass as she sprinted across it. The ground of the backyard, though covered with a grand, expertly manicured lawn, was uneven. Nora felt as though she would tumble at any moment, but didn't slow down to catch her balance. And turning back was not an option. Everything behind her was broken, smashed to useless chips with sharp edges. Dr. Bourdain's awful violations continued, growing more frequent and egregious with every year Nora added to her life. And after each sickening secret visit to his study, she'd leave a larger, broken-off piece of herself on the dark wood floor. Soon all she had left were her tucked-away wishes. Empty as they were, Nora still clung to them. She continued to close her eyes tight and blow out her birthday candles atop the chocolate banana layer cake, a homemade favorite, wishing for a return to the before, the one where Dr. Bourdain's only touch was a pat on her head as he walked by her on the way to his regular adult life. The before, when Mrs. Bourdain still watched her with warmth in her eyes instead of looking through her with barely veiled contempt. The one where she and her mother would sit shoulder to shoulder in the kitchen, their heads tossed back, holding their bellies filled with laughter and raw shelled peanuts, and whispering stories about the ways of some white folks. Nora also wished that somehow her mother would notice the missing fragments of her daughter and go off looking for them, gathering them up from under the beds, behind the bookshelf, and beneath heavy rugs, and she would rinse and the dust and dirt from the side. Excuse me. She would rinse and dust the dust and dirt from them and slide the pieces back into place, making Nora whole again.
I think that really frames kind of how who Nora is at a young age and in a very particular moment in her life that also kind of guides who she becomes later in life. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And I forgot to ask you to do one thing, and Deesha, if you can hand me my phone over there because I didn't do it myself. Could you please make sure that you turn off your phones? And I noticed mine was over there, and I hadn't done it. So next we have Deesha, and Deesha's going to read to us from her short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies.
So this is a collection of 9 short stories, and I'm going to read an excerpt from one of the stories. It's called Snowfall, and the 2 main characters in the story, they have also had these disapproving mothers. I was thinking about the way Nicole's excerpt started, but they are adults. They grew up in the South, and what you need to know for this excerpt to make sense is that they now live in a cold place that sounds a lot like Pittsburgh, which is where I live. And the narrator refers to we, and the narrator is a woman named Arletha, and she's referring to herself and her lover, her girlfriend, Rhonda, when she refers to we. We were born and raised in warmer places, Georgia and Florida. Warmer too in the residual charm, polite smiles, and gentility of the white people whose ancestors owned ours. In the South, the weather does not force tears from your eyes, causing the faces of passing strangers to register worry about you for a millisecond. It's the wind, you want to tell them, but a millisecond is not enough time. In the South, the weather does not hurt you down to your bones or force you to wake up a half an hour early to remedy what has been done to your steps, your sidewalk, your driveway, and your car as you slept. But the South has hurricanes, they say. Yes, but not damn near daily, not for a full quarter of the year. You tell people up here that you're from the South, and 9 times out of 10, they say the same old thing. Sure you miss the sunshine. Rhonda and I both miss taking sunshine and easy morning commutes for granted. But what we really miss are the laughter and embrace of our mothers and grandmothers and aunties, kin and not kin. We miss the big oak tables in their dining rooms where, as kids in the 70s and 80s, we ate bowl after bowl of their banana pudding as they talked to each other about how much weight you gained, like you weren't even there. We miss helping them snap green beans and shell peas, sitting at their kitchen tables, watching The Young and the Restless on the TV perched on the pass-through. We miss how they loved Victor Newman, hated Jill Foster, and envied Miss Chancellor and how she dripped diamonds and chandeliers. We miss their bare brown arms reaching to hang clothes on the line with wooden pins. We miss their sun tea, brewed all day in big jars on the picnic table in the backyard, then later loaded with sugar and sipped over plates of their fried chicken in the early evening. We miss lying next to them at night in their 4-poster beds with 2 soft mattresses covered by iron sheets and 3 generation-old blankets. We miss their housecoats, perfumed with absorbing junior liniment and hints of the white shoulders they'd spritzed on from an atomizer that morning before church. We miss tracing the soft folds in their skin when we held hands and watched our favorite TV shows in their beds: Dallas, Dynasty, Knots Landing, and Falcon Crest. We miss how they laughed and were easy with each other, how their friendships lasted lifetimes, outlasting wayward husbands and ungrateful children. Outlasted that time Alma caught Joe cheating and she whacked him on the top of the head with the sword he brought back from the war, but he told the people at the hospital he didn't know who did it. Outlasted having to hide your medicine bottles and your shoes because otherwise 7 of your 9 children were liable to steal them. We miss how they seemed to judge everyone but themselves. Or maybe that judgment was in the nerve pills they procured from the Chinese doctor on Bay Street who didn't ask questions. We miss their furtive cups of brown liquor on Friday and unabashed cries for Jesus come Sunday. We miss their one gold tooth that made us wonder who they had been as young women. We miss their blue crabs, shells boiled to a blood red and wash tubs top bricks over makeshift fires built in the yard. The wash tubs reminded us of cauldrons full of rock salt and cayenne-drenched water, bubbling and rolling, mesh bags of seasonings and halved onions and peppers floating on top, along with potatoes and ears of corn. We miss how they stood over those cauldrons like witches stirring a potion, with sweat beading on the tips of their noses and smoke swirling around their hands and wrists. They wielded long-handled spoons to press the frantic, flailing crabs toward their deaths. We miss how they made our Easter dresses, pound cakes, and a way out of no way. But we lost all those things when we chose each other. Only the memories remain, which is why, even though we grew up in different places, so many of our bedtime conversations start with, "Remember when?" As we lie there in the dark with our nostalgia and nothing to distract us from it. Not even each other, not anymore.
Thank you. Wow, I think there are a couple things that story brings to mind. And again, you said it when you first started off. Just the idea of the relationships between mothers comes through really strongly in this short story. And I think a goodly part of what motivates Nora is her relationship with her mother. Can we talk a little bit about why was that important to you in terms of developing these characters and who these women are, both on the page and for readers?
I was focused on writing a collection around the theme of Black women's sex in the Black church. And it was only after I turned in the manuscript that I thought, there's a lot of other stuff in this book that was not intentional. But my mother died in 2005. She had breast cancer. And that was the most difficult, but also defining relationship of my life. And I think, and even though, we were at peace when she passed away, I realized through writing these stories that there was unfinished business. There were still some mother-daughter things. And so in almost all of these stories, those elements are there. So it wasn't intentional for me, but I think that, our relationships with our mothers, for better or worse, they permeate, so much of our lives. And so a lot of my characters are grappling with things. And I think in general, beyond just my characters, mothers transmit culture in ways that fathers don't. That doesn't mean that fathers aren't important. It's just a different kind of relationship. Right. And so everything great that we learn from church, we get through our mothers. It's reinforced at home. And everything not so great can be reinforced as well. And so I think for my characters, that's partly why that shows up.
Okay. Nicole, you want to speak to that?
You said it really well. I think for me, I have a really good relationship with my mother. And I've always been fascinated when I hear stories of people who don't. Not because of situations where their mother is not in their life because they passed away, but a situation where there's a very contentious relationship between daughters and mothers. I find it fascinating because, like you said, so much from your mother informs your choices and where you go. And sometimes you want to do something different from what your mother has sort of instilled in you. So that's what makes you choose to do, go down this path. So if your mother tells you to go right, you're going to go left for whatever reason. So I've been fascinated with the fact that there's some people that have very, very difficult relationships with mothers. And I think it's because it's the first relationship, that's the first love, the first everything that you get from your mother. So I've always been fascinated with that kind of story. And I think a lot of my characters, the drama and trauma stems from some relationship, some family relationship, and it's usually the mother. Another book I wrote before this the mother and daughter were also very much at heads. Like, I mean, Nora and her mother are close, but they have different ideas about who Nora is and who Nora should be. Whereas in my other book, The Thunder Beneath Us, we have a situation where this mother somewhat has cut herself off from this daughter because of a situation that happened in the family. And she sort of doesn't blame the daughter, but every time she sees the daughter, she's reminded of it. So she decides to distance herself from the daughter. So those kinds of stories, like I said, fascinate me because I can't imagine what it's like to have a living mother and you two don't talk, or you're fighting, or have a very contentious relationship. So I like to explore that and try to find out how that feels and what that does to your relationships with other people.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about, because I want today to focus on not just the books that we're talking about today, but I also want to get a little crafty, talk a little bit about the craft of writing and the art of writing. And one of the things that I am always particularly interested in is your practice and your approach to writing. You know, we get folks like Toni Morrison who talks about writing 8 hours a day, right? You get, every writer has kind of a different approach. What's yours?
I was telling somebody recently, I was like, mine is haphazard.
Okay.
Whereas, Toni Morrison, had her set time, and I think about hearing about August Wilson,
Right.
who had this ritual where he walked around his desk so many times before he sat down to work. And I am just not that structured in my life. And, I think some of it is being a parent, though my kids are adults now. And so, but I spent many years, 20 years of writing around, their schedules and writing around other things. And so if I was, it's only going to be at 6 a.m., that wasn't going to happen. So it was a lot of, kind of writing as, catch as catch can, or setting aside time and going on writing retreats with other writers like our mutual friend Faye, things like that. I didn't get any kind of structure or kind of routine until the pandemic.
Okay.
And I think, for at least the writers that I know, we were trying to all stay connected at a time of a lot of isolation. And so some friends, writer friends, we would say 6 o'clock in the morning, we would get up and we would start because the day had to start again. So, that was time that was dedicated. And then others, it was like, we would call it co-working sessions, 10 o'clock at night. We could sit and, you could be scrolling Twitter, or we could be actually getting some work done, So those sort of things started to happen for me in the pandemic. But I'm mostly driven by deadlines.
Okay.
And so I just have a list of everything that's due and when, and I just started working down towards that list. And what I consider my work as a writer is not just writing, but also reading.
Okay. Yes.
And that's, that's part of my writing practice. So I spend a lot of time reading and a lot of time, as much time as I can writing. And I would say the other thing that has helped me have something even close to any kind of discipline is saying no, which is really, really hard, especially when, as writers, it's not like the kind of job where you put in this number of hours and then there's a paycheck at the end of it. It's really difficult to write something you don't know if it's going to sell, you don't know if anybody's going to want it, and still commit to that time. And the commitment isn't just, butt and chair, it's saying no to doing some other things.
Right.
Because, from the outside world, it looks like you're not doing anything. you look available unless you let people know I'm working.
Right.
And, and so while I may not always hold to a schedule, I do find myself saying no more and more so that I can say yes to my own work.
Okay.
I swear, I'm nodding so hard that I think my head's gonna roll on the floor. You've hit so many things that are so true. For me, as a journalist, I think as a writer who is also a journalist, that informs a lot of my systems. So I am deadline driven, very much so, even if it's a self-imposed deadline that I set for myself, because I think I need that structure, that I'm writing towards something. I can't just be sort of like, I'm lost in the muse. I can't do that. I have to have like a structure. Also, because I'm a journalist, I am big on doing research and having things sort of like structured in that way where I know what I'm doing each time. So for me, I do have a schedule, but being a mother of a 12-year-old, it's like, schedule, what's that? Who's she? Like, no, it changes everything when you're a parent. So for me, I think there's this old sort of antiquated piece of advice that a lot of writers give new or emerging writers, that is, write every day, and that's how you're not a writer if you don't write it every day. And I think that is not true. And I think that also makes people feel like they're failing at something they're trying to aspire to do. If you can write every day, then write every day. If it doesn't work for you, trying to squeeze your life into that is just going to create more misery. So I think, whether it's waking up at 5 a.m., there's something on Twitter, there's a club called the 5 a.m. Writers Club. So they all kind of get up at 5 a.m. and they start writing, and they sort of support each other. And they have, online meetings here and there. Some writers get together and they do writing sprints, and, you find your way to get the writing in. And I think that's important, to figure out what works for your life instead of trying to fit into somebody else's frame. For me, that is, I like to have a chunk of time, like a good 3-hour block in the morning, where I'm just devoted to writing. Now, working from home, that makes it difficult, because people think like, oh, you're home, let's chat.
Yeah.
So I've had to like train my family, my extended family, my sisters, my parents, like, oh, you're working right now? Okay, I'll call you later. So there's a lot of that where people feel like you are available because you're at home, but you're working, you have office hours, or you have a structure that you have some goals that you're trying to meet. But I think if I were going to give anybody advice about creating a schedule for themselves, it's looking at your life and what you can do, and make your writing work for you instead of the other way around, because you're just going to create a headache for yourself if you're like, oh, I didn't write today, or I didn't write 1,000 words today, I failed at this. And then you start to feel unmotivated. You start to feel like, maybe I shouldn't even bother with this. And, all the hard work starts to roll back on itself. So it's just finding the schedule that works for your life and building around that is what I would say is the best thing.
Let's talk for a minute about the books themselves. I think one of the things that intrigues me, Nicole, about your novel is that it sits in kind of a canon almost of the literature of passing. And there are several works that we see throughout Black literary history in particular, where we focus on what it means to be a Black person who passes. And I'm thinking of books like Imitation of Life. I'm thinking of the classic Nella Larson book, Passing, and one that we talked about earlier, which is a newer, more contemporaneous book, The Vanishing Half, which also deals with this phenomenon of, in many ways, these books are about women. We do have some books that talk about men in passing, but a lot of them are about women in passing. Talk a little bit about why that was important for you to highlight in this book, and why that focus.
Well, to be honest, there's an actor who shall remain nameless. If you can guess it, keep it to yourself. But there's an actor, she is mixed race, and she has famous parents. So that's the only way that you kind of recognize it. Oh, she's half Black, is because of her parents. If you were to just meet her on her own, you might think she's Italian, maybe, or something like that. So she could pass, so to speak. And I've always watched this actor, and I'm like, wow, if you didn't know who her parents were, you really wouldn't know what she was about, like what her background was. So that's what started me thinking about a character that is not famous and doesn't have famous parents, and you meet them and people make an assumption about this person and they don't do anything to correct them. So it's a lie of omission that I was interested in digging into, like, what if somebody made this assumption about you, like, oh, you must be from California, and you don't say, no, I'm not from California, I'm from Connecticut. You just can't kind of keep it rolling. So that's where it started for me. And then I started looking at some of I watched Imitation of Life, both versions of it. The first one was better,
Right.
And then I started reading other books and talking to people in general, because there are people to this day that have, like, I have a good friend of mine, her cousins, I think it's her second cousins, they are in Michigan and they are passing, like, in present day, because of various reasons. Their life is easier passing. And so all of that stuff fascinated me, and I wanted to just dig into, like, what would make someone choose this, you know? And I think, you know, for Nora, her reasons are because the life that she had before, she wanted to separate herself from that. She experienced something traumatic and she did not want to be that person anymore. So because people automatically assumed anyway, it was one of those things like, well, they assume that I'm white anyway, and they assume that I'm from this rich family anyway. And this makes my life a little bit easier, so why not go this way? And she makes this decision at a young age anyway, as well. So she doesn't have all the information that one would about who they want to be and their identity. So for Nora, her decision to pass was less about race per se, and it was more about, I don't want to be that person anymore. I want to be this other person that people already assume that I am.
Okay,
So I'm going to just assume this as identity and run with it.
okay, that's very interesting. And I think it's interesting that the choice that you make to tell that story as a novel, you know, the medium that we choose as writers in many ways kind of governs which way the story goes, which leads me to my question for you, Deesha, is that you've given us this short story collection. It's very tight, it's very compact, it's a small collection in many ways. And one of the things that I know about writing, you know, I'm working on a novel myself, I'm a short story writer, that in many ways it's harder to write a short story than it is to write a novel because you've got a finite amount of space in order to tell the full tale. So why did you choose to focus on these women and kind of lift the veil on church ladies or church wives using short stories as opposed to, say, a novel?
Because I've had the opposite experience that you described. I have not been able to write a novel.
Okay.
You know, there's a novel I've been working on since 2007, and you know, it's just not, it just hasn't happened. And but along the way, I started writing these short stories, and I didn't see a potential connection between them, but my agent did. So I had an agent for this co-parenting book that I wrote with my ex, and so she had been saying, you know, that novel is done. I'm ready to, you know, shop the novel. And I just kept stalling on the novel, but I started working on short stories. And so my agent had heard me read some of these stories at events. And so she had the idea that, like, perhaps I could take a hiatus from the novel, which I was anyway, because I wasn't working on it, and get intentional about building a collection around this theme of Black women, sex, and the Black church. And she called them church lady stories. And I wasn't thinking of them that way. When I had, you know, as writers, we often have to do like write an artist statement or something like that, which I don't enjoy, but, you know, because people want you to kind of boil down, like, what do you do? What do you write? And I would always say, I write about dissatisfied women. And it's because, you know, 20 years ago when I started writing, I was dissatisfied. And I was writing, you know, Toni Morrison talks about memory and imagination. And so my imagination was rooted in memory and nostalgia of growing up in the South. And I grew up in a very woman-centered household and was sent to church and was surrounded by women in church, women outside of the church. And so I was always watching Black women. And so not surprising when I started to mine my memories and nostalgia, you know, Black women really loomed large. And I think that for many of us, even if we don't think of it in terms of it's the church's teaching, because the church's teachings, you know, are secular as well in terms of, you know, a lot of the gender double standards that we have and those sorts of things. We don't always think of it as church, but, you know, those are the roots. And so when I thought about those women and how I used to imagine their lives, you know, when I was young and didn't have a context, and then now I'm an adult myself, I got married, had children, I did all the right things, and I still wasn't happy. And so I wasn't comfortable writing my own story. I wasn't comfortable writing memoir at that time. And so I kind of gave my dissatisfaction to these women from, you know, my youth. And so I wasn't thinking of them as church ladies, but certainly the things they were grappling with had to do with their sexuality. And the church is obsessed with sex. You know, when people ask me, well, why do you write about sex in the church? And I'm like, because what is the church most obsessed with? They're not obsessed with greed. They're not obsessed with, sloth, gluttony, you know, of all the deadly sins, you know, it's really sex, and particularly women's sex lives. And, any good storytelling, whether it's a novel or short story, you want conflict. So that's where the conflict is. And so that's really what I was drawn towards. So once my agent suggested that, that felt more doable to me than this novel that had eluded me for, at that point, almost a decade. And she was saying that if I could get 3 short stories published, that we could go to market with the strength of a partial manuscript. That versus finish this novel, I was like, I can do that. I can finish these stories.
Okay.
I had already written a couple, and it's like, okay, write more, get them published. And so by the time we went to market with the partial manuscript, I had 3 stories published and 6 written.
Okay.
To this day, I still haven't finished that novel, and I've written 2 more short stories and a ton of essays since this book came out. And I keep saying I'm going to finish the novel now, and I haven't. But I did decide that my next book is going to be another short story collection because that's what I'm working on.
Okay.
And my agent's like, you can always come back to the novel. But I even thought just yesterday, there are things in the novel that I can see as short stories. There are 2 short stories I want to pull out of that novel. So I'm going to leave the novel writing to Nicole, I think. I think that's it.
That's interesting because a lot of the times agents and publishers will tell you,
Oh, yeah.
that
Short story
Short
collections
stories
don't sell.
don't sell.
Don't sell.
They
You
just can't get
call
them
us
out.
when you have a novel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see that you flipped that kind of script. And not only
Yeah.
did you do that, but you did it in a way that positioned short stories as saleable in the marketplace.
That's what I hope happens now, that people realize that a lot of these, from you gotta write every day, so many of these rules are elitist, and they're
Old white men
and it's gatekeeping.
Right.
It's gatekeeping and it's bullshit. And so people should just write whatever they want to write.
Right. Yep. I think one of the things that holds true about the literary world is that many of the rules of writing were put down on paper by old white men who were gatekeepers. And so I think it's wonderful to see women like you who are kind of breaking those boundaries and changing how we approach writing and publishing. I want to talk a little bit for a moment about something that I think shows up in both of your work, and that's naming, and how we as authors choose the names of our characters, but also how those names impact the development of the character. And an example being for Nora, right? She is given names and then she takes names. And the names that she takes are the names that she feels like define her the way she wants to be defined. And in your book of short stories, almost every short story, there's naming that is significant. If I look at Jael, if I look at the last short story, I think it's the last short story in the book,
Daughter
and mother, right? Where almost everyone else in the story has actual names except for mother and daughter. And that really drives the development of the story. Talk about naming a little bit and how you approach that. Why is it important?
Well, I'm almost embarrassed to admit, but I oftentimes will go through like baby book names for my characters, and I'll write it down on paper and see what goes together, the surname and the first name, and it has to make sense to me. And sometimes I'll have like, should it be this and this or this and this? And it's a whole long system. But sometimes the name just sort of jumps out to you and it's like, this is that character for me. I think if you're writing a book and you have a character, name them something with meaning and something memorable. I'm sorry, no one wants to read about Bob Smith. They just don't. If you have that chance to name a character something memorable, do that instead of, just, and often I will look into, the background on the name or the ancestry in the name, and I will choose it from that. So there's a lot of like, sort of mad scientist stuff that goes on with me and naming the characters. So it has to make sense to me. It has to have a rhythm to it. Mm-hmm. But both the first and the surname need to go together and they have to work together. So for example, with Nora's fiance, his last name is Beaumont. Mm-hmm. And that just felt like, rich. There was something to it that there was a texture to it that I was like, oh yeah, it's Beaumont, the Beaumonts. the Beaumonts of New York. So all of that stuff is what goes into what I think about when I'm naming a character.
Mm-hmm.
I have yet to write a story where the character, I've seen some books where the narrator or the main character doesn't have a name and everybody else does, or mother-daughter. I have yet to do that myself, and I find it interesting when that happens, and there's usually a reason for that. But I like to name my characters something memorable and something where the name conveys something about the character as well.
Okay. Talk a little about Jael and the idea of mother-daughter and how you approach naming in your story.
Yeah, so Jael, there's a story in the Bible about this woman named Jael, and I read the story not in the Bible, but I read about it somewhere else. And Jael was a woman who, and this story is in the book of Judges, if anybody wants to look it up, and it's told in the Song of Deborah. Jael is a woman who, her husband was part of the Israelite army, and this general from an enemy army comes to her door, battle worn and asking for water. And she invites him in, and instead of water, she gave him, it says, the translation is milk or heavy cream. And I guess it was really heavy because he fell asleep and had like the itis, like he just passed out from this, he was nice and full, fell asleep on the floor, and she drove a nail through his skull and nailed it to the floor through his head. And that was such a incredible act of violence, incredibly personal. Like if you shoot somebody, that's violent. You stab somebody, that's personal. And so to nail, I was just struck by the violence, but also that it was a woman in the Bible. I couldn't recall any other Bible stories of violent women in the Bible. So I said, I'm gonna save this. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it, but Jael is a trip. And so, and in the Hebrew, it's Yael, but we changed stuff. So Jael. So I saved it, and then when I knew I was building a collection, a few years later, I was like, okay, I want to do something with this. And when I'm looking for ideas, sometimes I play what if. What if somebody gave this name to a child? Like, who would do that? And what implications would it have for their lives to have this as your namesake? And what if she was a 14-year-old Black girl who had this name? Who gave her this name? What could be some family naming tradition? Black folks name people from the Bible. Maybe it's something kind of random and they just went with it. Who would do that? It wouldn't be her mother, it would be an older woman. So then I had Jael, and I had, her great grandmother. And Imitation of Life was one of my mother's favorite movies. Her other favorite movie was The Bad Seed. I don't know if anybody knows about Rhoda. Rhoda was a trip too. Rhoda ran around killing people with her shoe. She'd hit them in the head with the shoe and throw them in the river. And so kind of as an homage to my mother, I thought, what if Granny, the great grandmother, what if she thought of Jael as like a bad seed? Like she had named her this, and it just kind of becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where this girl is, she's wilding, but with a reason. And so, as I developed the character, it's set in the mid-early 80s. And so she's someone who experiences street harassment, and she fights back. And there's also a predator in the neighborhood, and I'm not going to give any more away than that. But that's who Jael became. But that was the root of it. That story.
I just wanted to add one thing. When you mentioned that you were like, oh, I'm going to save this name, I do that often with people I meet. Yeah. So, even from elementary, from school days, there's somebody I'm like, oh, that's such an interesting name, and I will just keep it. There was a girl I went to an all-girls Catholic school, which also, there's some of that in there. I went to an all-girls Catholic school in Montreal, and there was this girl, it was a year ahead of me, and her name was Ainsley Savage. And I was like,
that's a name.
So I kept Savage, and I've always I find a way to put it in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. There was another boy in my elementary school named Murray Lightburn, and I used Lightburn in another novel as the surname of the main character. So I thought that was such a memorable name, Lightburn. Mm-hmm. And memorable without being like, that sounds made up. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I keep names of people I meet. So if I meet you and I'm like, what's your name again? So I might be just making a note of that.
Let's talk a little bit about, I'm curious for you, Nicole, because so Nora makes some really hard decisions throughout the book. And at the end, she makes a fatal decision. Why was that the way for you to have her find resolution in this moment? Because she could have done several other things in that moment.
Yeah. Well, for me, the character, I'm very into characters that are flawed and people who are good sometimes, but they just make bad choices. So I find that interesting. Like, you know, as human beings, you're never all good or all bad. We walk the line, we juggle it sometimes. And I found Nora to be someone who is making a lot of bad choices because of things that happened in the past. So that's what is informing a lot of her bad decisions. And out of desperation to hang on to this life that she's created for herself, she makes very, very bad choices at the end. And for her, it was just out of desperation. Like, I cannot go back to this, so I'm going to do whatever I can. What lengths am I going to go to? The full measure I'm going to go to make sure I protect what I've created for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's driving her decisions. It's just desperation and not wanting to return to what she was.
Okay.
Without giving anything away.
Deesha, so I was talking to another writer the other day. You know Vanessa Paul, the woman who wrote A River of Stars? Anyway, she's also an op-ed columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle.
Okay.
And she recently posted on her Instagram a picture of this beautiful peach cobbler that was inspired by your short story, Peach Cobbler. And so she said to tell you one, that it turned out really well.
Okay.
And but that started me thinking about the role that food plays in some of your stories. Talk a little bit about why you decided to use food as a way to not just develop story, but layer and give us nuance into who these people are.
Yeah. I don't know that it's possible to write a good Southern book without food.
Mm-hmm.
It just, I'm not capable of doing it. And so, you know, when I was mining my memories and everything, you know, so much of it is, you know, food is present. There's crab in 3 of the stories. There are crab boils in 2 of the 9 stories. And, you know, looking back, having the backyard crab boil was, you know, some of the best times. You know, people were, you know, family and friends would gather. You know, watching my mother, you know, the description I read about the crab boils, that was my mother. My mother did that on Saturdays, and she would she would build a fire on bricks in the backyard. She'd get a metal wash tub, and she would get it boiling, and then she'd drive, you know, just a few miles to get the crabs and bring them back live and drop them in. And, you know, looking back, that felt like ritual to me. You know, so a lot of rituals for me are around food. Feeding people, that's how we love. You know, my grandmother died just a few days ago, and I don't remember my grandmother ever telling me or anybody, I love you. But the way she fed us, that was love.
Yeah.
You know, that was really special. And so from as long as I can remember, food was never just food. And so my grandmother who just passed away was my maternal grandmother. But when my mother went into hospice, the day she went into hospice, my grandmother came and she brought a pan of banana pudding. My grandmother could cook anything because she was known for her desserts. And she brought banana pudding and everything. So she said, so when people visited my mother, they could have something. And she didn't say anything about my mother's cancer or anything about love, but I mean, how incredibly loving, you know, was that? And so so this week, when I was thinking about my grandmother passing away and she had dementia, so we had lost touch. And I discovered that my grandmother had dementia because some years ago I called her because I wanted to make banana pudding.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, now, how did you, and I asked her something, and her response was complete gibberish. And like, I just started crying because I was like, it's gone. And, on social media now, they joke and say, we're losing the recipes. Like, literally, that was lost with her because she didn't write it. She didn't write it down. So, that's what food means to me. And so, the idea that you always have to make enough. So in case somebody comes by, and then also more personally, I think about my story, How to Make Love to a Physicist.
Right.
One of the things that she does to fall in love with herself and her body isn't to deny and starve and not eat. She eats well.
Right.
She takes the time to make foods, whole foods, not packaged or processed foods, but showing herself that love by putting the effort into making delicious foods for herself. So I think it was just the fact that food has always, been tied so close to love and family and culture.
Okay. That the story you just mentioned, How to Make Love to a Physicist, when we were talking earlier, that is like my favorite story in the book, and I think you said it was your favorite story as well. I think it's the last line that really strikes you, as she claims space for herself at the end of that story. So we are almost at time, and I want to make sure, though, that I open this up to you, our audience, so that you can ask these writers some questions about their work, about their practice. So I'm going to open it up to you to join the conversation. Any questions that you might have for them? Yes.
I would love to hear you talk about your revision process. Some people write before they look back. Some people have the editor do it all. I wanted to know, like, how you did that. How much do you write before you look at it again? And are you constantly revising?
Yes. Honestly, I personally think revision is writing. Writing is revision. I don't know any editor who's going to do it all. So whoever told you that is fibbing, because there's no editor that's like, yeah, give it to me, I'll do it all for you. No, so revising is writing. And I personally, I know there are people that talk about the messy first draft, and they just vomit up everything, and then they go back and revise and do like several other drafts. Me being a journalist, I will edit as I go. And I know sometimes that might slow me down a little bit, but I do know where I want to go with the story. So I'm not just sort of like free falling, but I will revise as I go. Because sometimes you're writing something and you're like, wait a minute, you know what? That makes more sense to do X and Y earlier. Or what if this person said this? Or you meet somebody and they say something really interesting. You're like, that is a quirk. Let me put that in this book that I'm working on right now. So for me, I like to kind of revise as I'm going and edit as I go. The revision process can be a slugfest. It's not fun. It's tough because sometimes there's something that you really like and it has to go.
Yeah.
Someone might, you have a really good second reader or somebody that can tell you the honest truth. Sometimes you'll pass something on to a friend and they're like, that's good. And that's all they tell you, which is kind of like, give me this back. You didn't help me at all, give it back. So sometimes it's tough because there's something that you really worked hard on, or a chapter or a section or a character, a whole scene has to go. And so it's tough. They talk about kill your darling. Sometimes it's like kill the whole family and start fresh. So it's tough, but you have to, it's part of the process. Writing is revision. You just have to get into it. And, sometimes it might mean putting it down for a little bit and letting it rest. You go on to do something else. Maybe you're reading something else, and then you go back to it with fresher eyes, and then you can kind of see it like, okay, now I have to get rid of this character. I have to get rid of this scene. But revision is so key. It's vital. It's a vital part of the writing process.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to take another question from the audience if there is one. Yes.
Hi, I'm just wondering, first of all, I want to thank you all for being here during this panel. I also wanted to ask Deesha about the piece that brought you so much joy to write, and then also how you thought about curation, how you thought about putting pieces together in the order.
Is that AK?
It is.
Oh my goodness! It's so good to see you. What was the first part of the question? Because I got excited when I realized it. Sorry.
What brought you the most joy?
Okay.
What brought you the most joy, and how you thought about curation?
And I love that it's most joy and not favorite story, because that's a harder one, because I told you How to Make Love to a Physicist, but in many ways, Peach Cobbler is a favorite now because so many people love it too. But the joy, there were two really. How to Make Love to a Physicist, that was really fun and joyous, and I definitely was feeling myself like playing like puppet master, like will they be happy, like she ghosted him twice, what, how is this going to end, and like I felt very powerful in deciding that. But also the sections where she was coming to love herself, I really enjoyed writing those sections. The other is Instructions for Married Christian Husbands, which was just fun. It was just pure, I was just wilding out, and was inspired by social media, because initially I had written maybe 10 to 20 pages of a traditional narrative about a woman who had serial affairs. And I had set it aside, like you were just saying, sometimes you write stuff and you come back to it later. Sometimes that's a week, it's a month, it's years, And I came back to it because I needed one last story for the collection. So it's not last in the lineup, but it's the last one I wrote. And I looked at those pages and I was bored. And I have a rule that like, if I'm not interested, nobody else is going to be interested. If I don't laugh, nobody else is going to think it's funny. And I just thought, I don't have anything fresh to say about, infidelity. Like, what, he's going to catch feelings, or she's going to catch feelings, or his wife's going to find out. Like, none of that interested me to explore. But I was talking to a friend who sent me some meme, and it was these women who I guess, had affairs with men. It was like, I heart her husband. And my friend and I were laughing, like, who does that? Like, why would you like be so bold? And then I guess the wives clapped back, and it was like they made a shirt that said like, but I have his 401k. And so while it was funny, what struck me though is that the man is nowhere we're pitting women against each other, and the man is almost, ancillary to the whole thing. But even the language we have for, the woman in that situation, we say side chick. It's literally, the person's in the margins. So I start the what if, right? So what if instead of being in the margins, what if that woman was at the center? And instead of her following this man's rules, which are all around like how not to get caught, what if she made the rules? I was like, now that I'm interested in, that's fun. I haven't seen that anywhere, right? So I took those pages that I had and I salvaged like two sections. There's the introduction, which is like the infantilized husbands of highly successful Christian women or something like that, or low-hanging fruit. Like I love that whole section where she talks about, it's almost like she's preying on them, but it's all consensual. So she's sort of she's talking about how easy these men are. And then there's another section where there's a description of the man undressing. That felt like ritual. I love ritual. So I kept those two pieces and made them, the introduction to the instruction manual, and then there was the whole, undressing part. And then I just started building in like, what else would be in an instruction manual on how to, for this woman, how to have an affair with her. She wasn't saying, this is how you have an affair. It's like, this is what I want. Mm-hmm. The other piece that made that really joyful is this, I was writing the section in that manual about me, like where she's saying, this is who I am. And she said, I own a bakery in town. I make the best, I own a bakery. I make the best peach cobbler in town. And I realized I had named this narrator. I was like, this is Olivia from Peach Cobbler. And I got so, I didn't plan it, but I think I couldn't let go of that character. Like she was still with me and she showed up as an adult. You can say for better or for worse, but she showed up. And I got really excited about knowing, well, this is where she landed.
So Peach Cobbler shows up in this book several times, because we get Peach Cobbler in the story where the mother is making peach
Right.
cobbler for the minister. I'm not going.
Peach cobbler is the blackest dessert I can think of. It's like,
Yes,
it is
right. Oh my
the
God.
And surprise, we have peach cobbler for everyone.
And the curation, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, yes.
So, curation, it was, I tried not to think too much about, how will these stories go together. I knew I didn't want redundancy. So it was really easy to curate because when I came up, I hit my word count that the publisher gave me. The stories were different. I didn't, worry that there was going to be something that was overkill or anything. It's a mix of voices, it's a mix of forms, it's a mix of point of view. There was one story that was called Must Love IPAs that was in the package when I got my book deal, and I just felt like it was a weak story, and I wasn't interested enough in making it better, so I just pulled it out. So that was it for curation.
Okay. And then I think the first part of your answer speaks to this young lady's question about revision. It's interesting to me that story did not come to you initially in that form, because form is a very important part of that story.
Yes.
Yes, yes. So we are actually at time. I could sit here, I've got like 25 more questions for these ladies, but we're actually over time right now. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. Deesha and Nicole will be around to sign some books for you guys. We want to thank the Elm City Lit Fest for hosting us today. Again, this is the second annual Elm City Lit Fest, which means that there's going to be a third annual Elm City Lit Fest. Please make donations to the organization so that we continue this effort and so that Michelle can grow what she started a year ago. We want to say thank you to People Get Ready Books for providing this lovely space for us this afternoon. And again, please buy some books because that's what they do here. I am Lisa D. Gray. You can find me on Instagram at OVOSSF. You can read my work if you go to my website, lisawrites.life, and tell us your social media handles if you have them, or where folks can find you.
I'm Deesha Philyaw on all platforms.
Oh, that's so smart. Some chick has my name on Instagram, but anyway. So I'm Nicole Blades on Twitter, and on Instagram it's Nicole_Blades because that other lady has a name. And then you can find me on my website, NicoleBlades.com, and I'm on TikTok, just _Blades on there. I'm not doing any dances, but that's where I am. But you can definitely find more about me on NicoleBlades.com.
Well, again, thank you all for coming this afternoon. Let's give these ladies a round of applause. And again, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, I'll definitely